Good morning, afternoon, evening, and welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents. Concerned Citizens of Laguna Woods is an organization dedicated to peace, economic and social justice, good government, and a clean environment. One way of achieving that mission is listening to experts discuss pressing local, national, and international issues. Before COVID struck, concerned citizens met regularly to hear these experts. After COVID arrived, concerned citizens turned to Zoom, video recording talks, panels, and debates for later broadcast on this channel. Now that COVID is in remission, our main menu is again in-person meetings. But for those of you unable to join us, Village TV is video recording our in-person speakers for later broadcast on this program. In addition, when the right opportunity comes along, Concerned Citizens Presents will continue to offer the occasional remote speaker. We hope you enjoy today's program.
Well, what a great crowd we have here. Look around, great crowd. For this, our first Millie Hicks Memorial Lecture, our distinguished speaker is Barbara F. Walter, the Rohr Professor of International Affairs at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego. Have you noticed how every professorship or chair or school now has a name on it, a donor? It's true that they can't find one without a donor's name. It's like selling rights to a stadium, but that's another story. So she earned her PhD at the University of Chicago and did postdocs at Harvard and Columbia. Professor Walter is one of the world's leading experts on civil wars, political violence, and terrorism. Her books include the award-winning Committing to Peace, Why Negotiations Fail, and Civil Wars, Insecurity, and Intervention. But her newest, How Civil Wars Start and How to Stop Them, explores whether the U.S. is heading towards civil war. She'll clarify how she uses that term, civil war. Spoiler alert, it is not big armies facing each other, facing off. Professor Walter has spent over 3 decades studying civil conflict. In that book, she examines the dramatic rise in violent extremism around the globe. Iraq, Ethiopia, Philippines, India, Syria, Sri Lanka, et al. And she sounds an alarm on increasing likelihood of civil war in our nation. Professor Walter is a permanent member of the prestigious Council on Foreign Relations, frequent guest on TV news, an active consultant for the World Bank, the UN, Departments of Defense, and State. You may have read her in the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, LA Times, etc. In 2012, she co-founded the award-winning blog, Political Violence at a Glance. One thing I saw on her personal website shows her authenticity. She said she's pleased when her research appears in the New York Times and the New Yorker, which she referred to as her, quote, her favorite hometown publications. And then later, a few sentences later, she was talking about her other favorites, and she said, quote, her favorite food is a slice of pizza folded in half and eaten by hand. And every real New Yorker knows that that's the only way to eat pizza in New York. You may recall there was a recent candidate who was ridiculed for eating pizza with a knife and fork. Remember that? I think it may have been Mitt Romney, I'm not sure. But, you know, that just shows her authenticity as a sometime New Yorker. So, Professor Walter is widely published in many leading academic journals. She's given many briefings at highest level U.S. diplomatic, intelligence, and military bodies, far too many to recite here. So I'll just tell you a few titles of her articles, talks, and briefings to show her scope and maybe to suggest a question or two by you during Q&A time. So here are a few of those titles. How do civil wars happen? 6 ways the internet is shaping the new civil wars. The jihadist threat won't end when with ISIS's defeat. Is that ISIS's, or is that many ISIS's? I don't know, forget it. The extremists' advantage in civil wars, ethnicity in civil war, reputation in civil war, why separatist conflicts are so violent, bargaining failures in civil war, and the strategies of terrorism. So I hope those whet your appetite for what's about to come and maybe prepare some questions pressing on those topics. So without further ado, Concerned Citizens proudly gives you Professor Barbara F. Walter. Are you going to talk from here or are you going to talk from there?
It is an absolute pleasure to be here, and I really do love pizza. I could have cheese pizza for breakfast, lunch, and dinner every single day. I don't think I would ever get tired of it. And I do miss really good New York pizza, which San Diego does not have. My name is Barbara Walter. I'm a political scientist. It's kind of strange to hear somebody introduce me because I see myself as somebody who spends the vast majority of my time alone, sitting in my office in front of a computer screen and usually writing. And when I was writing this book, it took me 2 years of working on it 7 days a week, 10 hours a day. And as I was writing it, there were times when I would have to step back, that it was almost overwhelming for me. And I would just start shaking my arms and I would think, I better get this right. This is too important. I have to get this right. But as I was doing that, I really never thought it would have the reception that it did. I didn't think it would resonate with the public the way that it did. And I am so, so very grateful. So what I'm going to do for the next 50 minutes is really tell you the story of how that book came to be, why I wrote that book, and what the framework is that I'm basically, I feel like I'm giving it to the world so that the world can understand what's happening, not just here in the United States, but it's happening in all democracies around the world, especially in some of the more liberal democracies. You could just as well apply what's happening here to Italy, to the UK, to France, to, in some respects, Germany, and then if you go further afield, certainly to India, to Brazil, to the Philippines, and we could keep going. So as Jonathan said, I have been studying civil wars for over 30 years, but during that time, my focus was always outside the United States. I've studied everything from Syria to Mozambique, to Northern Ireland, to Afghanistan, to Cambodia, Laos, you name it. In 2017, I was invited to serve on a task force run by the CIA. It's called the Political Instability Task Force. It's been around since 1994. And the goal of that task force is, or was, early on, to come up with a predictive model to help our government predict where around the world governments might experience political instability, political violence, and civil wars. And the way they put together that predictive model is they brought into the task force data analysts and experts on civil wars. The experts were, for the most part, academics. They were political scientists, economists, anthropologists, sociologists, anybody who would have had a reason to study civil wars and political violence. And early on, they asked the experts, the data analysts asked the experts, tell us everything that you know about the possible risk factors for civil war. And there's been an enormous amount of scholarship done. A lot of it was quantitative studies over the last 30 years. Most of those studies are ensconced in universities. They're behind paywalls for academic journals. They're not accessible to the public either because they're too expensive or because they're so technical and poorly written that nobody would have the patience to read through them. And so one of the reasons I joined the task force is I was grateful that this could potentially be a bridge to the outside world for this great scholarship. Anyway, the data analysts asked us for these risk factors, and we said, well, there seems to be a lot of them and very little consensus. And we gave them about 38 different factors. Some things that you would think would be obvious, things like poverty, income inequality, how ethnically and religiously diverse a country was, but then other things you wouldn't necessarily think about, how large in terms of territory a country was, how big the population was, whether it had a lot of difficult terrain, and that ended up being important in some of the studies because scholars suspected that if you had a lot of mountains or if you had a lot of swamps, that these were places where rebels could hide and it was harder for the police to root them out. Anyway, we gave the data analysts these 38 factors. They went away, and when they came back, they said, we ran all sorts of different models looking for the most parsimonious one. And it turns out that there's really only two factors that best predicted the outbreak of instability, political violence, and civil war. And it wasn't the factors that the experts thought would be the most important. So we were surprised. The first factor is something that academics call anocracy. An anocracy is just a fancy term for a partial democracy. It's a government that's neither fully democratic nor fully autocratic. It's something in between. So think about a situation like you have in Singapore. Singapore holds elections. The people of Singapore love to vote. They have incredibly high turnout, and yet the same party wins every single election. Or think about another situation where you have elections, competitive elections, and you don't really know what the outcome of those elections are going to be, but whoever wins the election, once they go into, get into power, there's very, very few institutional constraints on what he or she can do. Those are different types of anocracies. So it turns out that full, healthy democracies almost never experience civil war. Full autocracies rarely experience civil wars. Almost all of the violence happens in between. The second factor that ended up being really important was whether the citizens in those anocracies organized themselves politically into political parties that were based mostly around race, religion, and/or ethnicity, and not around political ideology. So if you're trying to visualize what a country that had these two features would look like, think about Yugoslavia immediately after the fall of the Soviet Union. So Yugoslavia suddenly was independent, it suddenly had the ability to pick whatever political system it wanted. Yugoslav citizens were incredibly enthusiastic about democracy. They set up competitive elections very quickly, and it looked like that country was going to transition to democracy in a very short period of time. Then there was this man, Slobodan Milosevic. Slobodan Milosevic, and he is just one of many nefarious characters who emerged during this time, but Slobodan was one of the worst. He had been a lifelong communist, a member of the Communist Party. He had been in power throughout the Soviet era. He's suddenly facing a brand new world where if he wants to maintain power, he has to run in elections and he has to win those elections. And he knows he has a problem. He knows that Yugoslavs know that he's a communist, and he knows that Yugoslavs don't like communists. So he's pretty sure that they're not going to vote for him. But he's smart and he's strategic, and he realizes that he might have an advantage. He knew that the largest ethnic group in Yugoslavia were the Serbs, and he was ethnically Serb. He also controlled the state television and the state radio. And so he had a propaganda arm, and he began to use that to his advantage. And he started to broadcast a continuous message to Serbs that the world was changing, And things could go poorly for them. And the thing they really had to watch out for were the Croats, because if the Serbs didn't organize around their Serb identity, if they didn't vote for a Serb to become president of the new Yugoslavia, the Croats were going to do that, and they were going to vote a Croat as president, and if that person was successful, they were going to throw Serbs out of their jobs. They were going to throw Serbs out of the military, and they could eventually start killing Serbs the way they had done in World War II. And this message was very, very effective, and Slobodan Milosevic ended up winning the election. And it didn't take long after that that the Civil War began. So if a country had these two features, if it was an anocracy, this partial democracy, and it had political parties that were based mostly around identity rather than around some larger set of political ideas, the task force considered that country at high risk of civil war, and I'll explain in a little while what that means. And that country was put on a watch list. We actually called it the watch list. And that watch list was sent to the White House. I don't know what the White House did with it. I suspect the White House watched that country. And if the government was a government that the United States deemed strategically important to the United States, then we probably helped to bolster it. And if it wasn't, then we probably helped to see it unravel. But that was the model that we used. It was quite effective in helping to predict. And here I am, 4 times a year. I'm sitting in a conference room in suburban Virginia with a lot of really, really smart people. And we're talking about where around the world political violence was likely to break out. We knew which factors were most important. And yet we're never allowed to talk about the United States. We never talked about it. We never studied it. The CIA is absolutely not allowed to study the United States. That's absolutely the way it should be. But I was a private citizen. And I'm sitting there starting in 2017, and I know what's happening. I've seen the data. I know the measures that the CIA used to measure whether a country was moving towards anocracy or not. And I knew that both of these two features were emerging here in the United States, and they were actually emerging at a relatively rapid rate. So I started to write this book. The United States' democracy was downgraded for the first time in 2016. The scale that the CIA uses to measure whether a country is an anocracy goes from -10 to +10. -10 is the most autocratic type of government. Think about Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, North Korea. +10 is the most democratic type of government. Think about Denmark, Switzerland, Canada. The United States had been a +10 for many years. In 2016, the US was downgraded to a +8. And it was downgraded because international election monitors who come to the United States like they come to every other democracy when elections are held, they came to monitor the 2016 election, and they deemed our election free but not entirely fair. And it was not entirely fair according to them because, in fact, Russia had been successful in meddling in that election, and because we have an electoral system that puts the parties in charge of running the elections and counting the votes at the local level. This is something that, as far as I know, no healthy, mature democracy does. Canada did it for a while and then completely revamped their electoral system. They now have what many countries have, which is an independent election commission that runs the elections, so that if you cast your vote on Prince Edward Island or you cast your vote in the Yukon in Canada, it is done exactly the same way, and it's counted by this independent commission. That's the way elections should be run. We do not do that here, and it makes our democracy look a little bit less democratic than the healthiest ones. We were once again downgraded in 2019, down to a positive 7. And we were downgraded because the executive branch, the White House, was refusing to comply with subpoenas handed down by the legislative branch and was refusing to hand over documents which the legislative branch demanded. Now, that might not seem like a big deal, but it actually was. The main check on executive power is the legislative branch. And if the executive branch basically thumbs its nose at the legislative branch, that suggests that you have an executive branch that in some ways is running amok. We were again downgraded for the 3rd time in December of 2020, down to a positive 5. The inocracy zone goes from -5 to positive 5, which meant by the end of 2020, we were officially considered an inocracy by the measure that the CIA uses for its task force to study other countries outside the United States. This is not my measure. I had nothing to do with it. This was a measure that was compiled by a nonprofit on the East Coast. And so they deemed the United States, downgraded the United States to a +5. And the reason for that was that we had a standing president who was refusing to comply with the results of a democratic election and was actively trying to overturn it. That pretty much puts you in the inocracy zone. So, had the CIA been allowed to study the United States, in December of 2020, we would have put the United States on the watch list and we would have considered it at high risk of civil war. Is war imminent? I will talk about that in a few minutes. We know, we have a sense of what the risk risk is. I'll talk about that in a second. The other thing that we know is we know who tends to start civil wars, especially ethnically, religiously, or racially based civil wars. And if we do have another civil war in this country, it will break down along racial and religious lines. The groups that tend to start these types of wars are not the poorest groups in society. They are not the groups that are most heavily discriminated against, and they are certainly not immigrants. Those groups tend to be, they have lots of grievances, they have lots of reasons to want to rebel and change the status quo, but they generally don't have the capacity to do so. They don't have the ability to mobilize, they don't have the resources to mobilize, and governments tend to be watching these groups very carefully. The groups that tend to rebel, and we could talk about examples in southern Philippines, in northeastern India, in northern Ireland, in Israel. The groups that tend to rebel are the groups that had once been dominant on a particular piece of territory, politically, oftentimes socially and economically as well, but are losing that power. And oftentimes they're losing that power because of demographic changes. Those demographic changes can be as a result of disproportionate birth rates between two groups, but it's oftentimes the result of immigration. So if you think about, there's an area in northeastern India where you have the Assamese. The Assamese have been the ethnic group that have dominated that region forever. But when the British were controlling India, they began to encourage Bengalis from Bangladesh to move into that area, in part because it was sparsely populated, in part because it had rich soil, and in part because Bengalis tended to be better educated, and the British colonists basically wanted a minority group that they could install into civil service positions and positions of power to help control that region. The Assamese, as you can imagine, were not particularly happy with this, and they slowly became a minority in that area and eventually started a civil war to reverse that. That is a very, very typical story, and I can give you lots of other examples. If you think about here in the United States and you think about the rise of violence, domestic terrorism or violent extremism has been increasing significantly here in this country starting in 2008. Some of that has been on the far left, but most of it has been on the far right, and it is almost always perpetuated by whites and in particular white men. And if you think about the history of this country, who has been the dominant group in power since the very inception, it has been whites, and it's been white Christian men. And if you look to see which group demographically is declining, if you look at a whole host of social and economic factors to see which group is declining, it is white men, and in particular, white men with only a high school education. That fits the profile of the types of people who are perpetrating the violence. Groups in decline tend not to go down without a fight, and that is what we are seeing here. Many people in the last 10 months have said, I can't even imagine a civil war here. It's inconceivable. And my answer to them is, it's inconceivable if your vision of a civil war is an 1860s version of a civil war. And I think that is what most of us think about. We think that there's going to be a big chunk of America that's going to secede, and they're somehow going to put together a conventional army, and they're going to have uniforms, and they're going to face off with the U.S. military to fight it out. That is absolutely not going to happen here. If you look at countries, especially powerful countries, democracies with powerful militaries, and if you look more generally at the types of civil wars that have emerged in the 21st century, it's a particular type of modern war. It's what we consider insurgencies. These tend to be decentralized. They tend to be fought by multiple different militias and paramilitary groups. Sometimes those groups will work together and coordinate with each other, but actually sometimes they're actually competing with each other. If you look at the militias that have grown on the far right, they tend to be of two types. About 65% of them are white supremacist groups, and about 25% of them are anti-federal government groups. So they're not exactly the same. There is overlap between the two, but you have anti-federal government groups that are not white supremacists, and you have white supremacists who don't hate the federal government, they just hate minority groups. So that's the type of war that we're going to see here. They are going to do everything in their power to avoid any sort of confrontation with the U.S. military or U.S. soldiers. They're going to take violence directly to the population and to civilians. In the early stages, what you often see are targeted terrorist attacks and bombings of particular buildings. That could be a black church in Detroit. That could be a supermarket in Buffalo. It could be a federal building in Oklahoma City. But then you will also see that opposition leaders, and that includes politicians, federal employees, and that could include judges who are known to be sympathetic to your enemy. They will be targeted with assassinations. And of course, the strategy that's being pursued is a strategy of intimidation. If you can't gain control of the entire country, you can perhaps use terror as a way to intimidate your enemy into submission so that the best people don't run for public office, so that judges, good judges, and judges who were willing to uphold the law retire early. And so this is a way, in effect, to gain via violence what you couldn't gain via legitimate political channels. So people then also ask me, are we on the precipice of civil war? And my answer is no. On the task force, if you have those two features, you're considered at high risk of civil war, you have about a 4% annual risk of civil war. Again, that doesn't seem like it's a lot, but it accumulates pretty quickly over time. If a country it continues to have those two features, if it does not strengthen its democracy, and if its political parties do not reach across ethnic, racial, and religious lines, every year that those two features continue, the risk goes up by 4%. So after 10 years, it's 40%. After 20 years, it's about 80%. The United States is no longer in the anocracy zone. We are now at a +8. So in some respects, that is good news. We were upgraded to a +8 after there was a peaceful transfer of power in January of 2021. And after we had an administration that was willing to adhere to the rule of law. The piece that's concerning is that we were not upgraded because any of our democratic institutions were strengthened. There has been absolutely no reform of our political system since Joe Biden has come to office. Our institutions, if anything, are weaker than they were in December of 2020. The only reason we have been upgraded is because you have an individual in power who has not been willing to concentrate more power in the hands of the executive branch. But you can see the problem there. If we are relying on the goodwill of the individual to uphold our democracy, that's not a recipe for lasting success. In fact, that was one of the things the Founding Fathers were really, really worried about. They understood human nature. They understood that human beings are flawed and that when given a chance, many of us will be greedy, power hungry, will not be thinking about the greater good. We will be thinking about ourselves, and therefore, anybody with that amount of power needed to be constrained, and so strong institutions were really important. And that means if our institutions are weak, which they currently are, and we get an individual in power who wanted to do what Viktor Orban did in Hungary, or what Erdogan did in Egypt, or what Bolsonaro has wanted to do in Brazil, or what Modi has done in India, that they have the ability to do so. So, what can we do? The good news is that unlike most people who have experienced civil wars, when I've talked to them, they say, we didn't see it coming. And I'll ask them specifically, tell me the moment you knew that you were going to have a civil war. Give me the warning signs, the red flags. And they always say, we had no idea. You know, we knew things weren't great, but we thought it was a blip. And we were all so busy having children and going to jobs and taking care of our parents and doing all the things that everybody does in their busy lives. And we just didn't pay close attention, and we didn't think we had to. And by the time violence broke out, it was too late. But they didn't know the risk factors. They didn't have somebody who served on the task force who could tell them, we know, this is what you need to look out for. And when these emerge, you have to act. And so there is time to turn this ship around. So what do? I'm going to give you two kind of commonsensical things that we can do, but are actually quite difficult to implement. And then something that is surprisingly easy to implement, but we have shown no signs of doing that yet. The two commonsensical things would be strengthen our democracy. We know that full, healthy democracies do not experience civil war. We had a full, healthy democracy for many, many years, and we are in the process of unraveling it piece by piece through voter suppression acts, through gerrymandering, through continuing with the filibuster, through appointing loyalists to count our votes, and you could go on and on. These are ways to unravel and weaken our democracy, and they are, in the long run, quite dangerous. The second thing that we can do is to have both of our parties reach across racial and religious lines. The Republican Party, if you prior to, let's say 2008, 20 years ago, if you walked down the street and you encountered a white person, you wouldn't really be able to tell what their party affiliation was. You had about a 50-50 chance of being correct. That started to change in 2008 when the white working class began to gravitate towards the Republican Party. And they gravitated towards the Republican Party for lots of reasons, but one of the big reasons was that they were the losers of NAFTA. Clinton had signed the North America Free Trade Act, and the argument that the Democrats had made and Clinton had made was that this was going to be a great thing for America and Americans and the American economy, and all ships would be lifted as a result. But of course, that's not true. Everybody knew or most people who study this knew there were going to be losers. They knew that the manufacturing jobs, the well-paying, secure manufacturing jobs that were holding up our middle class, and especially our middle class with just a high school education, that those were going to leave the country and they were never going to come back. And neither party took any measures to shore up that group and to provide them with a safety net that would allow them to thrive in the future. And that then created a subset of people who were deeply disaffected, who saw the quality of their life decline, who were resentful of the changes that were happening, and became easy fodder for extremists who began to court them with some pretty radical ideas. If you look at the Republican Party today, it is almost 80% white in a country that is overwhelmingly multi-ethnic and multiracial. But if you look at the Democratic Party, in some ways they could also be considered an ethnic faction. The vast majority of African Americans are Democrats, the majority of Asians, the majority of Latinos are Democrats. Most Muslims, Jews, atheists are Democrats. There is a real split along these lines, and this is not healthy for a country. So we could encourage the parties to reach across these lines, but we're not seeing that happen either. Instead, they're almost kind of digging in their heels. I don't think reform of our political system is going to come from our government. It's not going to come from the Democrats because they now know they do not have the votes. Biden attempted some reforms at a time when Democrats controlled both the House and the Senate, and they did not have the votes to get them through. And the Republicans aren't interested in democratic reforms, in part because they're in an incredibly difficult position where they are tied to a very, very passionate base of white Christian voters who do not want the party necessarily to reach across party lines. And given that they are the fastest declining demographic in the United States, and they are currently a minority of voters in the United States, even in the current system, they do not have enough votes. And so they certainly do not want to create a system that makes it easier to vote, especially easier for urban voters and voters in places that skew Democratic to vote. So we're not going to see reforms from the top down. So what's the easy solution? When people ask me what's the single most important thing that you think the United States should do to reduce our risk of political violence and civil war, my answer is always the same: regulate social media. And when I say regulate social media, I do not mean censor what people put on social media. I think we should all be able to put whatever we want on social media. That is not the threat. That is not what is dividing us. That is not what is creating all of these negative societal outcomes that we've been seeing since the late 2000s, that people increasingly believe are a result of the dominance of social media. I think we should regulate the algorithms. What most people don't understand is that the business model that the 5 big tech companies all pursue, and the 5 big tech companies are all American companies. They are all based here in the United States, and therefore we actually could do something about this. Their business model is very simple and on the surface benign. Their goal is to keep people engaged on their devices as long as possible. They don't have any political agenda, just keep people on their devices as long as possible. That way they can collect more data which they can then sell to advertisers, and that way they get more advertising revenue because people are on their devices longer. But they're smart, and when they designed their algorithms to keep people engaged, they hired a whole series of psychologists, and they ran a whole series of experiments to see what type of content keeps people engaged the most. And lo and behold, the type of content that keeps all of us engaged is the content that appeals to the oldest part of our brain, which controls our fight and flight response. And it makes sense because that is what has kept us alive this long, and it's very, very attuned to particular information. Anything that's threatening, anything that creates fear, anything that creates anger, keeps us engaged with content longer than material that makes us happy or makes us calm. That's just a physiological fact. And so the algorithms are designed to pick out that type of information, the more incendiary information, the information that makes you feel afraid. And it pushes that out to a much, much larger audience than the audience that is getting the calming, happy information. Now, we don't know for sure if social media is causing a whole series of bad outcomes. Democracies were increasing for almost 100 years until 2010. That was peak democracy in the world. It's been declining ever since. And it's been declining even in the most stalwart democracies, including the United States, the UK, Sweden. We also know that there's been a rise in hate crimes, not just here in the United States, but across the globe. We know that there's been a rise in ethnic and religious nationalism across the globe. If you track internet penetration in regions around the world, it tracks with an increase in democratic decline, political violence, ethnic nationalism. So we don't know, we have no way to confirm this yet because tech companies have refused to release the full range of their data to academics. And there's a reason why, because only with that data can you definitively prove that this is true. But we know that they know these effects are happening, and it's because of social media. And we know that because whistleblowers like Frances Haugen, who worked for Facebook, back in December of 2021, she released tens of thousands of pages of Facebook documents to the Wall Street Journal and to Congress and various other groups. And those documents showed that Facebook was running studies on the effects of its algorithms on democratic decline and political violence, and everything including the rise in depression, anxiety, and suicide in teenage girls, the gamut. And the internal Facebook studies were all showing that in fact it was having this effect. And the reason Frances Haugen and other whistleblowers have come out in public is because they were hopeful that these internal studies would cause people like Mark Zuckerberg to change their practices. And when they saw that, in fact, they did not change anything, that's when eventually they went public. So let me just end by saying the United States is the first country that is going through this first white majority country that's going through this demographic transition from a white majority to a white minority. But other countries will follow. Canada and New Zealand will be next. And we suspect with climate, the rise of climate change and climate migration, that it will also happen eventually in Western Europe as well. We have our whole history been or for at least our modern history, been leaders of the world, especially in terms of democracy. We can allow this transition to tear us apart, or we can use this transition to show the rest of the world how you can actually embrace this change and become a truly multi-ethnic, multi-religious democracy. And in the process, we can actually live up to this great founding motto that we have, E pluribus unum, where out of many we will become one. Thank you.
If anybody has questions, we'd ask you to come up here and line up and ask your questions. Please do not pontificate for a long period of time. Be brief and ask your questions. We don't want anybody sermonizing tonight. Thank you very much.
There's one thing you should know. We are taping for TV and YouTube. So if you ask a question, you expect you might be on that.
Yeah, I thought it was an excellent speech. So the thing on everybody's mind is if Donald Trump is indicted and charged and sent to jail, do you think that might be the catalyst that sets this off? And the second thing is, that sets off the Civil War. And the second thing is, do you have any books for sale tonight?
The second question first, I do not have any books. My editor would crucify me if she knew that. It doesn't, yeah, I'm sorry, I do not. But you can get it online very easily at your independent bookseller or wherever you like to get it. In terms of Trump being indicted, I'm actually skeptical that he will. That makes me a bit sad because I don't know, I think there should be justice, and I feel like the rest of us adhere to the law, and other people shouldn't be immune. But if he is indicted, obviously, when the Justice Department went into Mar-a-Lago and searched his house, the Twittersphere was erupted with threats to go to civil war if he was indicted. We have a sense of some of the triggers of civil war, but it is one of those things. I was talking with Jonathan. It's stochastic. That we know the underlying conditions, but we don't exactly know what the trigger is going to be. Generally, the triggers in democracies tend to be two things. If the group that's declining loses a sequence of elections. So what we see is that groups will adhere to, they will honor the system as long as they believe that they have some chance of winning in that system. But if you lose a series of elections, especially in a majoritarian democracy, where it becomes pretty clear if you have the votes or you don't have the votes, then that could be a loss of hope for that group. And it could encourage some people to begin to embrace the more extreme position, which is already preaching, we got to burn this all down. We're going to seed chaos. We need to go to war to take this country back. The second trigger that you tend to see in countries like the United States is a government overreaction. So many of you probably remember Waco and Ruby Ridge. And the U.S. government learned a lot from those two incidences. Federal agents went in. In both cases, people were killed. This was used by the radical right to vilify the federal government. They used it as clear evidence to support their claims that the federal government was evil and was overreaching into the rights of private citizens, and it helped to boost membership in those groups. The federal government has learned and has since changed their policy. Their policy, I think right now they call it radical patience, or so when something like that happens, and of course extremists are aware that this could be a trigger. They're aware that it could actually help them recruit people, that government overreaction is a means to radicalize average citizens. So they will often try to provoke a very harsh response by the government, and the government has learned and hopefully will not make that same mistake again. The Trump indictment, that could be a trigger. I'm sure the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and the 3%ers and other groups will argue that this is yet another example of the federal government and the left, the Democrats, trying to steal this country away from them. Whether they're successful in using that to launch a civil war, I don't know.
Someone has to neutralize the venom. There is an organization, Braver Angels.
Yes.
6 years old, all over the country, free. You can get workshops on them.
Yeah.
Do you see this is the beginning of the way we have to go? Do you think it'll be successful?
There have been a lot of grassroots organizations that have emerged over the last 10 or so years. Braver Angels is one of them. It's nonpartisan. It works. Its main mission is to bring Democrats and Republicans back together again. But there are other ones. Citizens United is a group out of Seattle that goes around the country holding what it calls Civic Saturdays. Civic Saturdays are modeled on church services, but the goal, rather than to essentially, worship a God, is to worship the Constitution and worship community. But it's really designed to teach people what it's like to be a good member of your community, teach young people civics, which is no longer being taught in class. And so there's hundreds of these organizations, and I do think that's important. If you're not going to get reform from the government, from the top down, then one of the means for reform is to have citizens demand it from the bottom up. And part of that is going to be through people understanding what our democracy is, how power is divided, how important it is to vote, what do you need to do to vote, and so you get people to vote at higher numbers. But part of it is also teaching people about peaceful resistance, teaching them how peaceful resistance has been a really, really powerful and effective tool to force politicians to change when they otherwise might not want to change. So I do think those grassroots organizations are important. I'm not sure we have that much time, though, to wait for those organizations to work their way across the country and to have a big enough effect.
Why are hate, violence, and irrational behavior so widespread and prevalent among supposedly rational human beings?
So I don't know how many of you are on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram. A majority of Americans now get their news on social media, and just recently I read a majority of them are getting it from TikTok. If you are familiar with that, you will. How many of you read the newspaper online? Okay. So my husband and I used to read the paper until about 5 years ago. And we just liked the morning ritual of sharing sections and reading the actual physical paper. And then we thought, well, this, we're killing a lot of trees. We need to get with the program. Let's get it online. And we went online. And it took us a number of years to figure out that the New York Times Online does not feed you the same articles that you get in the paper. Okay, pay attention. The articles that it's feeding you and that you're seeing when you scroll are the most popular articles, or that they're the articles that they think that you want to see. Now, I want to read the articles on the protests in Iran. I want to read the obscure articles about something weird that's going on in Myanmar. They were never, ever coming up to my feed. I would have to go searching for them. And if you are familiar with the New York Times online edition, their search function sucks. Like, even if I know what article I want to read, I oftentimes can't find it. So we just switched back to the actual physical paper so that we could actually get the full range of news without the New York Times and its algorithm curating it for us. And this is one of the most reputable papers in the country. Think about if you're only getting your news from Facebook, or you're only getting your news from TikTok. You're not seeing 99% of the news that the major newspapers are covering. So why are we filled with hate? Because the algorithms understand that hate gets us riled up. We get really angry, right, when we read something that, that is designed to induce that emotion. And we are more likely to send that to our friend and to our mom and to comment on it. And suddenly we've engaged with the platform, and suddenly that platform has 3 more data points on us. And that wouldn't have happened if we'd read an article about dandelions, which we would have thought, that's kind of cute, and then scrolled past. I really think that is what is driving a lot of this anxiety, anger, hate that we're seeing, which is at higher levels than it was pre-internet.